The world is watching as the United States considers ending its, 33-year nuclear testing moratorium. And this isn't just some technical debate about physics anymore, right?
Not at all.
It feels like a real high-stakes reckoning over strategic survival. In this global environment where, frankly, restraint seems to be rewarded with aggression.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment.
Great, so let's try and unpack this.
Yeah.
It feels like a monumental shift.
Absolutely. So we're diving deep into some source material a listener shared, focusing right on this renewed debate over U.S. nuclear explosive testing.
Okay.
Our mission today really is like a crash course.
Yeah.
We need to understand the strategic necessity here, which seems driven by hostile adversary actions.
Right, necessity, not preference.
Exactly. Then the primary goal, demonstrating American resolve. And finally, the staggering logistical hurdles. I mean, these make an immediate response almost impossible.
And the news hook, it's huge. October 30th, 2025, the president suggests basically start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis.
Yep. That phrase definitely got attention.
That didn't just rattle the diplomatic community, did it? It felt like it signaled that Washington believes, maybe, that decades of unilateral restraint, they've become a strategic weakness.
Precisely. And that announcement, it comes right in the middle of escalating global tensions. It feels like a direct reaction to how our rivals are behaving.
Russia, for instance.
Russia in particular, yeah. They've been demonstrating some pretty aggressive nuclear coercion. They've recently tested new delivery systems, things like the Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile.
Right, that one.
And the Poseidon torpedo. These are systems, they seem designed specifically to intimidate the West.
And then meanwhile, you've got the other major player, China, accelerating its nuclear arsenal expansion faster than, any other power on the planet?
That's what the sources indicate. China's on track to become a nuclear peer of the United States within a decade.
A decade, wow.
And look, this isn't just passive expansion. There's evidence, or at least suspicion, of potential cheating. Satellite imagery suggests increased activity at China's Lop Nor test site. This is between 2020 and 2024.
Okay.
And this activity has basically forced the U.S. to state, officially, that it cannot rule out activities inconsistent with the international zero-yield testing standard.
Let's pause on that term, zero yield. We hear it a lot. For you listening, what exactly is the zero-yield standard? Why is that the line we care so much about?
Good question. So zero yield is really the core of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Now, the U.S. signed it but never ratified it.
Right.
But the standard means no measurable explosive nuclear energy should be released during any test activity. It's supposed to be the firewall against a live detonation.
Okay.
So when we talk about adversaries possibly crossing that line, we're basically talking about them potentially regaining the ability to refine and modernize their weapons in ways the U.S. has voluntarily paused since 1992.
So the core question seems pretty stark then. Does the U.S. have to resume live testing to successfully deter strategic attacks, to counter this mounting threat? Or do we risk being totally outpaced by rivals who just refuse to follow the rules of a game only we seem to be playing?
It really does feel like that kind of difficult choice for national security leaders right now.
Let's dig into the specifics driving this. We know China's building silos rapidly, but Russia's actions seem more focused on active coercion.
They really are. I mean, the Department of State, the Defense Intelligence Agency, they published reports accusing Russia of conducting what they call supercritical nuclear tests.
Supercritical. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
So to clarify, a supercritical test is one where the nuclear material sustains a chain reaction, releasing significant energy. But, and this is the key part, potentially still below the threshold that some monitors might detect right away.
So if that's true, Russia could be actively developing new capabilities while kind of skirting the edges of the very agreement holding the U.S. back.
That's precisely the argument proponents of testing make. And Russia didn't help matters by de-ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty back in 2023.
Right, they formally backed out.
Which really just points to the absolute failure of arms control negotiations lately. Both Russia and China have essentially refused to even engage in preliminary nuclear arms control talks over the past decade.
So if the U.S. is facing this open coercion from nations that are either, maybe testing on the sly or just flat out refusing to talk, how long can Washington really justify sustaining a moratorium that seems, functionally useless?
It really becomes a question of strategic sanity, doesn't it? Proponents argue that the U.S. sticking unilaterally to a treaty that is, for all practical purposes, dead in the water, it's an act of strategic self-harm.
Hmm.
They believe our posture needs to be based on reality, not just optimism about arms control.
Okay, that leads us right to the core technical objection you hear from opponents of renewed testing. They often argue, look, explosive testing is technically unnecessary. The U.S. relies on the super advanced Stockpile Stewardship Program. Why spend billions to test when we have supercomputers modeling the safety of our existing arsenal?
And that is probably the single biggest point of confusion in this whole debate.
Right.
Opponents are absolutely correct that the Stockpile Stewardship Program, or SSP, it's phenomenal. It's incredible at maintaining the safety and reliability of our existing arsenal.
The ones we built decades ago.
Exactly. SSP uses computational modeling, advanced diagnostics. It ensures those weapons remain viable. It's a huge scientific achievement.
But I sense a big but coming here.
There is a huge but. Proponents argue that focusing only on SSP completely misses the critical point now. The purpose of considering testing today isn't primarily technical validation of the old arsenal. It's almost purely strategic signaling.
Okay, explain that. How does digging a hole in Nevada, setting off an explosion, how does that actually change the political calculation for Moscow or Beijing?
Because deterrence ultimately is built on credibility. The end goal is successfully deterring a strategic attack on the U.S. or its allies, right? So if an adversary tries nuclear coercion, maybe threatening tactical nukes in a conflict, a U.S. nuclear explosive test demonstrates American resolve. It shows we have not just the capability, but the political will to escalate if necessary. It signals we're serious.
So it's a kind of calculated escalation itself designed to, what? Control the narrative, seize the initiative.
Exactly. The objective is to convince a nuclear-armed adversary that they cannot simply escalate their way out of a crisis using nuclear threats. If they think they can use nuclear saber-rattling to intimidate the West into backing down, well, a rapid return to testing demonstrates we're willing to take significant risks to protect our vital interests.
Okay, strategic signaling makes sense. But beyond just showing resolve, you mentioned earlier there might be a technical gap with new weapon systems.
Yes, that's the other piece. While SSP works great for legacy weapons, the U.S. is currently building new warheads. This is part of its big modernization program.
Right, replacing older systems.
And testing might be necessary to ensure these completely new systems work exactly as designed. Modeling is a fantastic tool, no doubt, but for next-generation systems, it's not a 100% proven substitute for real-world data when it comes to ultimate reliability.
So the argument is, when you're betting the security of the nation,
proponents argue you have to move beyond simulation and back into reality, at least potentially. You need that empirical proof for brand new designs.
okay, so we have this strategic urgency building up, but now we hit this colossal wall of logistical reality. For all the talk about needing immediate resolve, you can't just flip a switch and conduct the nuclear test tomorrow.
That is the really sobering counterpoint. Despite the calls for immediate action, resuming nuclear explosive testing immediately, it's widely considered infeasible, just not possible.
Why not?
Well, because of the massive preparation required. The primary location is the Nevada National Security Site, the NNSS, and it hasn't hosted a test since 1992.
33 years of dormancy.
Yeah.
Wow. We're talking about huge infrastructure that was intentionally, mothballed. What kind of timelines are we actually looking at to fire off a test?
Well, it really depends heavily on the complexity of the test.
Okay.
If the goal is a fully instrumented test, one designed to yield serious scientific data estimates range pretty wildly, anywhere from, say, 18 months, maybe up to 3 years, 36 months.
3 years. That kind of defeats the purpose of a rapid strategic signal, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. However, proponents suggest that maybe a simpler demonstration explosion, one purely for political signaling, high visibility but lower complexity, could potentially be rushed, maybe in 6 to 10 months.
6 to 10 months. That still sounds incredibly fast.
Oh, it is. Even that 6-month minimum would be a truly heroic logistical undertaking.
Could you put that into context? Like, how big an operation was this back in the Cold War?
It was basically an industrial-scale effort. Historically, planning and executing just one single effects shot during the Cold War, that required 2 to 4 years of prep and execution time.
Years.
Yeah, years. And we're talking an average of maybe 20,000 personnel on site working constantly. We just don't have that kind of infrastructure or that specialized workforce standing by today. It needs to be rebuilt.
That makes even the 6 to 10 month estimate sound, well, extremely optimistic. What about cutting red tape? Can the president just sort of wave away the bureaucracy?
The president does have significant power here. They can declare a national emergency and waive all applicable statutory and regulatory restrictions.
Ah,
And some sources suggest this could theoretically cut down the timeframes, maybe by as much as 2 years off the longer estimates. But there's definitely skepticism about how much time that truly saves, given the environmental hurdles, the technical complexity.
mhm.
You can't just waive physics.
And crucially, who's actually in charge here? Is this a Department of Defense operation?
No, and this is a really key detail. The authority actually rests with the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration, the NNSA,
Not the DoD.
not the DoD. And this means Congress has to authorize and appropriate the massive funds needed for any restart. So you need political consensus, you need the money just as much as you need the technical readiness. It's complicated.
So the U.S. seems kind of stuck between the strategic necessity of responding to coercion and the hard logistical reality that we simply cannot flip a switch. Okay, let's pivot now to the escalation risk, because obviously this path is fraught with danger. Opponents argue quite strongly that any U.S. testing would likely trigger a global chain reaction of tests.
That is absolutely the core risk that has to be weighed against those national security needs we discussed. Opponents warn this kind of move could just blow apart global non-proliferation efforts.
And Putin has already said something about this, right?
Yes, Russian President Vladimir Putin has already vowed publicly to resume testing if the U.S. restarts its program. So the moment the U.S. tests, potentially, the floodgates open.
But there's an uncomfortable reality, maybe, about who benefits most if those floodgates do open.
Exactly. Critics also warn that China, remember, they've only conducted 47 tests historically. Compared to the U.S.'s 1,054, China would stand to gain the most technical knowledge.
Right, they have less data.
They'd collect invaluable data on weapons design, warhead information, stuff they currently can't get easily because of the moratorium. So the U.S. might be demonstrating resolve, sure, but we might also be inadvertently handing Beijing the technical know-how it needs to rapidly perfect its growing arsenal. It's a double-edged sword.
This brings us squarely to the hard choices.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of resources would have to be traded off if the U.S. actually committed to getting ready to test again?
Well, restarting testing would demand a massive rapid investment. We're talking immediate billions of dollars.
Billions.
Billions. And this would inevitably divert critical people, specialized engineers, scientists, and financial resources away from the existing multi-trillion-dollar nuclear modernization efforts that are already underway and arguably behind schedule.
So it's a zero-sum game for those highly specialized resources.
To a large extent, yes. There just aren't that many people who can do this work.
And what if that best-case timeline, the 6 to 10 months, what if that proves impossible? What if the NNSS site simply cannot be made ready quickly enough to respond effectively in a crisis? Is there a plan B?
Well, that's perhaps the gravest risk and leads to the most radical choice. The president might order above-ground testing,
Above ground, wow.
which would be a symbolic and political explosion of just immense magnitude. To do that, the U.S. would have to formally withdraw from the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty.
The one that bans tests in the atmosphere, outer space, or underwater.
Correct. And that treaty requires 3 months notification before withdrawal. It would be a huge international step.
So the argument from, let's say, a national security first perspective, or perhaps more conservative stance, is that sticking to these decades-old treaties that our adversaries seem to be ignoring anyway, is less important than ensuring the credible resolve and defense of the nation.
That really is the fundamental philosophical gap here. Proponents argue that if the U.S. is facing active nuclear coercion from rivals who are clearly accelerating their arsenals without constraint, then sustaining a treaty that seems de facto dead is, well, maybe a dereliction of duty. They might view withdrawing from the 1963 treaty, however painful, as a necessary step to prevent an even worse escalation down the road from Beijing or Moscow.
Okay, so this deep dive really clarifies things. The debate over renewed nuclear testing isn't fundamentally about the science of maintaining old weapons anymore.
Not primarily, no.
It's about political resolve. It's about staring down these rising aggressive threats from China and Russia. And it forces this really difficult reckoning with the costs, the timelines, and maybe the diplomatic compromises required to restore test readiness as a credible lever of power.
Absolutely. The geopolitical reality seems to be that our adversaries are prioritizing their own strategic interests, their own nuclear expansion, while the U.S. has operated under voluntary constraints for, well, a generation.
So given China's accelerating arsenal, given the clear refusal of both major rivals to even talk seriously about arms control, It raises a really crucial question for you, the listener, to think about. If the U.S. is ultimately unwilling to pay the massive political and financial cost to prepare for the possibility of a live test, just as a strategic deterrent, what credible leverage does Washington actually have left to stop a new, uncontrolled nuclear arms race that seems driven entirely by Beijing and Moscow?